everybody, this is Alistair, and I am going to be processing this image which was taken by my very good friend actually, and it was on a workshop. So this is taken by a friend of mine, Jane. She was on a workshop, and this is taken in the northwest of Scotland last fall. It was near sunset, and the light was kind of skimming over this hillside and this mountain really nicely. And we had a clear evening without any wind, and obviously it was kind of calm. Now, compositionally, it's kind of does what it says in the tin, in that we have the main mountains are being kind of hit with this kind of stripy light, and then there's a reflection. So it's a kind of a straightforward decision to kind of center the horizon. There is a little bit more foreground than sky, and the first thing that has done is created where these you can see the points there, they don't actually line up, and that's just a little bit of wide angle distortion. So what I'll do to start off with is just come in and do some lens corrections, which is going to help for some of that the distortion that the lens has formed. But the next thing I am going to do straight away is to use the guided method of aligning the image, and what that does is it straightens up that perspective, so we instantly have an image now that lines up properly, and I think that's very important to do. Now, that's not something I do an awful lot, and I don't know how to get rid of those lines again, but we'll worry about that later. There's a couple of posts here, and we will probably clone those out at some point in time. How do I get rid of those lines? There we go. So now we have an image that's free of that distortion. So we now have something that lines up. Now, when I look at images like this, I instantly see little stones and things which kind of distract me a little bit. Little bright things near the edge of frames are not my preferred course of action. So I'm actually going to give this a bit of a crop. To just get rid of some of that distracting content, and it just makes it feel a little bit harmonious for me. The dark reflection of that cloud may prove to be an issue later on, but for now we won't worry too much about it. Now, with images like this, because it's so well exposed, with it's really pushed up to the right, we've got right up into this highlight area here, and we've got virtually no shadow detail. What that's doing is it washes out the image. It tends to make it look very, very washed out. And the first thing we should be doing is exploring what detail we have. So if I drop the exposure by a stop and a bit, you can see we've got quite a lot of light through the back there. We do have some color in these clouds, not a huge amount, but some. And the dark's kind of shadowy there. That's there are some deeper shadows there. So it's going to be a case of just fine tuning that exposure until it starts to look reasonably balanced. I might need to bring a brush in here. Now, you should know by now from my processing that I don't tend to start off with too much of an idea of where I'm going. This isn't the Guy Tal method, but you can see I tend to go about processing as almost a succession of things that bug me, elimination. So I tend to start by fixing things that sort of stand out as either distracting or they're catching my eye. They're taking me away from the main scene, as it were. So I obviously love this stripy light. I mean, it's almost like a tiger or a bumblebee or something. It's really, really cool. We don't have a ton of great light to play with, and I wonder if just pulling in a vignette early here. Let's need to stop inverting that. Pull in and bring in a vignette nice and early, and I think that might just help to kind of create the feel or the mood that this image may want to go into. I'm going to use a tone curve, I think, to brighten those midtones without affecting the highlights. I don't want to bring up the overall exposure because I don't want to push these highlights any higher at this moment in time. So I'm just going to brighten the little highlights, the midtones there a little bit. And it just injects a little bit of life into there. And I think maybe a tiny little bit of an S curve just to darken some of those shadows. But I am going to bring up my black point. I think it's getting a bit too dark. Now, as I said to you a few moments ago, I don't process images with this sort of massively conscious idea of where I want it to go. For me, I understand everything's at infinity. You know, we've got nothing in the foreground, so I can't add depth by making detail in the foreground, which I talk about a lot. These reflections on the left-hand side are really going to bother me, so I'm going to take this down to a 4x5 and just cut this content, and I can make it just a bit bigger now. Cut this content and end up with something. I almost wonder if we need that left-hand side at all. So I'm going to go with that. Now, by pushing this mountain off to the left of the frame slightly, we're helping to balance this point, which is up here on the right. There is no rule of thirds going on here. This is the rule of thirds guidelines. We have a centered horizon. This is way off to the right-hand side of the rule of thirds. That is not what you would consider a PowerPoint by any stroke of the imagination. So what we're doing is we're kind of balancing the point here with this mass here. And this feels right to me. Now, anyone who knows my work knows that it's all about feel. I think processing is about the articulation of feel. I am going to boost that warmth, and you can see that we're managing to inject some very beautiful luminosity into that hillside now. And I'm going to look at the overall white balance. Now, if we push this more warm to start off with, then the whole image is going to feel universally more joyful. And we can obviously go too far with that. If we go to the cool end, things are going to get a bit magenta. But I kind of like the coolness in some of those shadows. So what I might do is warm the whole thing and then come in with some split toning, and I boost the saturation first so I can identify the tone that I want to bring into the shadows. So it's about there. Now I don't have a number in my mind. So this is about the color that I would say, and then I can dial back the saturation. So what that's doing is if I just turn that off, that's the overall global temperature and tints that I've chosen for the warm tones, and I'm introducing some coolness into the shadow detail, but I can change what the midpoint is of that. So this is basically saying ignore a lot of those midtones and just make it the deeper shadows that become bluer. And you can see now that that's quite a gentle shift. I think I'm going to use the brush to introduce a little bit more warm light and contrast, or warm light certainly, into those areas of the clouds. Now, something I'm conscious of on the channel here is it's very easy to make a lot of processing complicated. It's very easy to go into Photoshop and do all sorts of complicated things with luminosity masks, etc. But we need to know what we're doing in Lightroom. I'm going to bring in a gradient here and open up a little bit of the darkness of this. Now I can do that with a bit of opening of the black point and a bit of the shadows. it was just getting a bit too dark down there. Some of those tones were just getting a bit too dark. And this way, there's a little bit more symmetry to it now. But yeah, I mean, this is coming along, but it's not finished. Now we've balanced the tones, I feel more comfortable in addressing some of the more beauty of these luminous areas. And I think a really good way to target these colors is going to be with the HSL panel. And I can just select that color and increase its luminosity. Now, as we increase luminosity, we actually decrease saturation. So I'm going to go back in and just boost the saturation of that color in particular. And again, if we just turn that off, that all we're doing with that slider is increasing the luminosity and the saturation of the orange and a little bit in the red. And what that's allowing us to do is just make those more joyful. Now, if I was going to come in and start thinking about, well, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? My concept of processing is to articulate the things in the image that give me joy or that I'm engaging with. Now, obviously, because I didn't take the photograph, I have to kind of make some assumptions about that. The fact I was at this location when this was being taken is definitely helping me. So it's going to be very interesting to see Adam's version of this. Not only is it a location that he hasn't been to, but it was an event that he didn't witness. So it's going to be very, very interesting to see what Adam does. And we'll be posting that video on here as well for you folks. Now, there's a few little things down in the corner here that we need to get rid of, these things. So now I think we're getting close to bringing the image into to Photoshop. But what I am going to do is I'm just going to quickly mirror the warm areas in that reflection. So we painted it in above and we hadn't painted it in below. Now, instead of darkening, which is what I did up here, I'm actually lightening here. So I've increased the exposure and increased the warmth. And that's just going to make that reflection more mirror what's going on above it. Now, don't worry too much about this. Reflections have to be darker than the thing they're reflecting. I think in photography, as long as it's not too glaringly similar, I think that looks pretty good. So I'm quite happy with that so far. I'm going to go into Adobe Photoshop, and this will allow me to do some of these other things that need to be done. So the first thing I'm going to do is just grab the stamp tool, and this is my kind of go-to cloning stroke healing tool. It does an incredible job now just with its kind of content aware fill. And I'm just getting rid of some of those little marks around the edges of the frame. There's a little bit of grass in there. I'll zoom in using the Command plus key, and I'll use the square bracket key. This is the left square bracket key to make my brush smaller. And I'm only doing this because Jane specifically asked me to clone out the power lines. And I'm just going to tidy up some of those little points there. This was a glorious evening. It was a really glorious workshop, actually. We had really fabulous conditions and a lovely group of people. It was just a joy to do my job on this particular workshop because everyone was just so in the moment and there was no judgment. It was just really liberating, and we got a huge amount of great thinking done. We had some really amazing discussions on that workshop. So just tidying up that power line. It's I'm going to say, Jane, that it's not super sharp. in the background there, so it's a little bit soft. So I will be adding some sharpness, I think, into this. Um, but yeah, generally quite happy with that so far. Now, let's see where to go now. I'm generally getting to the point where I'm quite happy with that. I think I am just going to pull this into Nick and make a kind of glowy color shift to this. I don't know why that's saying that I've got an update available, because I don't. So I'm going to just add some nice glow to that and balance the saturation a bit. Now, once you have a global color, if we use a cooler space, then you can see that we get this cool to warm transition, and it creates a feeling of depth and three-dimensionality. The warmer we go with the overall image, it makes it a little bit more homogeneous. So I think it's important to keep a balance between cool and warm tones. That will always give you more depth in landscape photography, rather than it just being all about warm tones. I think we need the cool to appreciate the warm. And I think this is a really good way of just bringing in that cool to warm. It's a bit like giving an Orton. I mean, realistically, you know, I could make a copy of this layer, blur it slightly, and then combine them with a layer mask or something, or a blending mode, and that would create a similar effect to this. But, you know, sometimes there's nothing wrong with going about it the quick way. I'm going to add a bit of tone contrast, but I'm going to dial this way, way back. This is good for keeping a bit of the grit in our photography, you know, to make it feel like land. And I'll keep that kind of sharp. And this is going to add a bit of a feeling of sharpness as well. So, where have we got to with this? The main reason for bringing it into Photoshop was to do the cloning, and I did want to add this sort of overall color palette. I'm quite happy with the way that's kind of looking. A really good trick is to look at it small. If you take it right down to quite a small size in the frame, it gives you an impression of the whole thing. It's very hard to take in an image when it's all filling the frame like that. But if you make it small in your browser, it's a really good way to show the kind of overall impression, and it is really, really cool. Of course, there's a bit of me that just wants to do something insane, like, you know, I could totally go with something like that, but that's just me. I'm in a very strange part in my life, so I'm making images that are a little bit less literal. Right, let me just think if there's anything else I really want to do to this. Just talk amongst yourselves while I finish this off. Yeah, I think I'm just gonna come in and do Command Save, and that will take it back into Lightroom, which is where we are right now. And then I'm going to come into the detail, and I'm going to add a fair old chunk of sharpening, I think, to this. And just, I rarely do sharpen, but in this particular case, I think the raw file needs it just a bit. So I'm going to bring that up to about, I'm just eyeballing this. If you hold down the Alt key and use the masking button, we can spot the sharpening. We can reduce the sharpening down to some of the areas where it needs it, and just take it off these smoother areas where we definitely don't need it. But yeah, you know, I don't know how long this has taken, but it's certainly, I think it's pretty good. I can hear Anne chopping in the room next door. And I think with this inverted, again, I'm just going to focus in on just producing a bit more impact in that middle section. So I'm kind of happy with that. So hopefully, Jane, this has been useful for you and everyone else who's been watching. I hope this is kind of useful. I've noticed that there's a post that I haven't got rid of, so I'm going to have to open it in Photoshop again. So I will do that and just go back in with my healing tool and get rid of those little posts. And there we go. So yeah, thank you very much, Jane, for submitting your image. For everyone else who's listening, everyone who's submitted images, I'm hoping to get through most of them. I can't promise I want to be able to process them all, but I'm certainly going to try and do quite a few anyway. So I'm not going to do them all, but over the next few months, I'm just going to, every week or so, pull one out of the bag and do an extra little processing video, because you're the people who support the channel, and it's the least I can do to try and have a look at some of your work. So Jane, there's your image. Hopefully this has been of some value to you, and it will be very interesting to see what Adam does with his version of it. So thanks very much for watching, and we will speak again soon. Bye.